Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Thursday, March the 26th. Keir Starmer is back on the diplomatic circuit today with little sign of a resolution in Iran after Donald Trump's 15-point peace plan was rejected, prompting the White House to warn that Iran could be hit harder than they've ever been hit before. I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. If we hadn't already got the message, Trump's press secretary said last night the US president was prepared to unleash hell if he doesn't get his way. With Iran announcing its own conditions, it's just more tit for tat. The Prime Minister, however, arrived last night for the Joint Expeditionary Force Leaders Summit in Helsinki in Finland. President Alexander Stubb is in the chair. He's actually one of Keir Starmer's favourite world leaders, I hear. He's hosting the gathering of leaders from the Defence Cooperation grouping. But Anne, I understand that it's not just Iran that's on the agenda at that meeting today.
No, Keir Starmer is very keen to show that he can still take a leading role in global affairs. After being a bit sidelined in the Iran crisis, is back to a focus on Russia. So Starmer will be hoping to talk up a decision to authorise the UK for armed forces of our own to seize Russian Shadow Fleet oil tankers in British waters, trying to keep that focus on Arctic security and highlight Russia's attempts to use the distractions of the Gulf to advance war aims. The link factor here, Sam, is obviously energy and oil prices. Russia's revenue from the sale of oil abroad has doubled since the start of the year to the highest level since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So Starmer is expected to use his meetings to argue that sanctions enforcement on Russia is all the more urgent because of the war in the Middle East driving up oil prices. That benefits Russia and, of course, then funds its war machine.
It just feels like global whack-a-mole at the moment. So many different problems. Oil and natural gas, it has to be said alongside, is pretty much the biggest global priority right now, hurting governments at home as well. The first signs of our government's contingency plans for Iran are now falling into place as the government races to ensure the UK has everything it needs in the months ahead after the global trading shutdown.
Well, that's just as well. And the former BP executive who worked for Gordon Brown in government, Nick Butler, saying yesterday that oil and gas shortages could come as soon as the next 2 or 3 weeks. So we've quoted him a couple of times on this podcast, something of a hawk when it comes to fuel supplies and the prospects. And he is underlining that the government should be seriously planning how they're going to handle that. So he's not mincing his words, even if the government tends to step lightly around the idea that there could be real shortages hitting us soon.
It's really striking he's not backing down as much as he's at odds with the keep calm and carry on approach of ministers today, as we've been pointing out all this week. Behind the scenes, I get this sense from a number of departments, the contingency discussions are pretty much this government's number one live priority. And another complication in this space is that other governments are starting to do much more visible things, even when it comes to petrol and diesel. This morning, I note that the US has issued a temporary emergency fuel standards waiver. What that effectively means is that their petrol on the other side of the Atlantic can have higher levels of ethanol to be sold at the pump. So you can see governments doing things there, whereas we just seem to want to have a conversation saying it's all fine. What is going on? Well, the Treasury's got fairly imminently a meeting with bank CEOs. Their headline message is expected to be, please can you do more to help vulnerable customers, because we're worried about the impact of possible interest rate rises and inflation pushing people yet further into hardship. And there was a big moment yesterday, I think, with Business Secretary Peter Kyle, who had a call with industry leaders, and people who were on the call tell me that the top line message from government really is we're on it in all sorts of different ways. There's a bit of an appeal for data. But we've had the first concrete outcome for business of all of this contingency planning. And it's got really fascinating politics attached because it's what's going on in Teesside. Now, there was a Teesside plant which was the casualty of the UK-US trade deal because Trump insisted that US get a carve out for ethanol at the last moment. And as a consequence, a big Teesside plant that produces ethanol and CO2 got shut down. But now that's being reversed.
Yes, and Kyle is acting because of concerns that imported CO2 could run short. partly because of the impact of soaring energy prices, as we've just discussed, and the impact on European fertiliser factories, which make the gas as a byproduct. Some plants in the EU have also been closed for planned maintenance. The FT has a story quoting a government official saying the irony is that the Teesside plant was shut because of a deal with Trump, and now it's reopening because of Trump's war in Iran.
So a cash injection from government sorting that one out. It's not just queues at petrol pumps that people are worried about at the top of government and business. All of this is part of a much bigger suite of concerns about shortages, not just now, but over the next few months. And I've had a number of conversations with industry and business and government about this. And I've picked up 3 areas where industry is warning government that they need to be most worried. And people in government say they know this and they're trying to plan around it, right? So the 3 areas to listen for are, first, jet fuel availability, because that can't be stored for very long. The price is up 72% and some airlines don't hedge. So there's a big question over what happens to summer and autumn flights. And just before we recorded this podcast, I see Bloomberg were pushing a story about soaring airfares ruining people's summer holidays, which wasn't very cheery. The second thing that's being raised as a red flag that industry want government to focus on more is fertiliser, because we simply don't have fertiliser facilities in the UK, and there's a worried about the impact of food prices. It's a critical time of year for ammonia, for fertilizers, because stuff's going in the ground for the first time. And this is about price as much as about supply, because price spikes just mean companies use less and the yields are lower. So obviously that just means there's less food. Food gets more expensive and higher food prices above and beyond those from the higher fuel and transport costs. And the third area, well, it's not everybody's top priority, but it's really important to industry, and that's helium, which is critical for the semiconductor industry, as well as MRI scanners, scientific equipment, defense systems. Qatar is one of only 2 global sources, and so the government has all sorts of potential plans it could activate, like mandated industry-held stockpiles, or finding alternative sources from Canada and Norway. But each one of these things poses logistical and bandwidth problems, very targeted solutions needed. But if they don't sort them out, the potential of just, like, bluntly, at the end, there being a big hit to growth is big.
There's been a lot of talk too about what the government will do about household energy costs. Sam, as you said, on Tuesday, the government's buying time before making decisions on that. But it's business energy costs that are really preoccupying minds as we head towards the end of the week. Businesses are not protected by an energy price cap, and they have to negotiate annual contracts with brokers. The rise in wholesale costs for energy, they're set to increase their electricity bills between 10 and 30%. Gas bills could be projected to go even higher, between 25 and 80%. And that is absolutely whopping. And just another factor, as you say, that reminds us of what happens in Iran and in the Gulf has huge impacts on business and on the growth outlook, therefore on the politics back home.
That's right. A lot of our listeners, we know this, Anne, that are in the interface between government, parliament, but also the business world. And so if you are finding disruptions or in need of contingencies, or you're picking up a discussion that's going on, do get in touch and let us know what the priorities, what the need, what the gaps are, because contingencies is going to be a subject that we deal with for weeks and weeks to come, I suspect, because this is a domestic story as well as a global one. But since we're talking about domestic politics now, let's turn to what on earth is going on with the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, former Chief of Staff, and his old mobile phone. That all got mixed up in Prime Minister's questions yesterday and has been obsessing Westminster. Just to bring you up to date with the background, Peter Mandelson resigned as our man in the US last September. And pretty soon after that, the Tories started talking about forcing all messages between Mandelson and every government figure, including on WhatsApp, to be disclosed. So that would put Morgan McSweeney and his phone and his messages to Peter Mandelson pretty much at the forefront of that disclosure. There were stories in the Sunday Times and elsewhere in mid-October in the media reflecting the fact that the Tories were going to do this. There were meetings in mid-October amongst Labour figures about how they were going to deal with this. And then on October the 20th, Morgan McSweeney's phone was stolen. And we're just getting around to learning about that. Now, we'll get almost no messages as a result, a few from Peter Mandelson's government phone that was handed in, but not his private phone, so not the bulk of them. The Tories are claiming that there was a cover-up. Yesterday, I asked Morgan McSweeney's friend, Steve Reed, about all of this, and listen to just how terse the reply was. At the weekend, you said that his phone was stolen before the Mandelson affair. That turns out that wasn't right. It was after he resigned. How did you get that wrong?
No, I knew his phone had been stolen, but it was months ahead of Parliament taking the decision that they took through the humble address to publish communications, so it was correct.
So it was a misspeak?
No, what I said was correct. It was months before Parliament passed the humble address.
The Mandelson affair, I think, was how you referred to it on the LBC on Sunday.
Well, what I meant was when the humble address in Parliament required the publication of communications.
Thank you for clearing that up. Morgan McSweeney's phone was stolen when this was the biggest topic. The Mandelson-Epstein affair was the biggest topic in the news. Labour knew at that point that Mandelson's WhatsApp messages to McSweeney could be forcibly disclosed. They were having meetings about the possibility just the week before the McSweeney phone was suddenly stolen. Do you understand how that looks?
Well, I don't really understand why people are trying to make something out of someone getting their phone stolen.
And what do you make of it all?
The big ugly thing that Starmer is less keen to talk about is this cluster mess of the story of that phone theft, but also how Morgan McSweeney handled it when he made that 999 call and didn't correct a statement saying that his phone appeared to have been stolen in Stepney when he was in fact in Westminster. So more questions than answers about all of that, and perhaps more substantially, why Downing Street itself didn't appear to have followed up the theft with Scotland Yard. Now, Playbook reporting that a number of text and email exchanges between McSweeney and Mandelson are still held by the government, and they will be released in the coming weeks. And I think the number 10 position will be to say, look, we're not trying to hide anything here. This was just unfortunate, and we are able to show you a lot of the messages. But there's a bigger question about what comes next in the court of Keir after the Morgan era. Dan Bloom has an account of that today for Politico, remembering that McSweeney resigned after a weekend of to and fro about whether he should stay or go. So we were all curious about where that left the bromance. Well, we learn now that at least they were still on drinking terms, because Dan's reporting Starmer slipped out of number 10 for a beer with Morgan McSweeney a couple of weeks after he quit number 10, or the Prime Minister agreed or facilitated him quitting. Moving on from the era is going slowly, and it's difficult. The PM won't be picking a permanent Chief of Staff or a Director of Communications in a permanent role until May. And this report also confirming Louise Casey's privately said she doesn't want the top job there as Chief of Staff. The ex-coms chief, Steph Driver, also not returning to number 10. So what kind of role is this Chief of Staff one going to look like? Jill Cuthbertson's been sharing the job at the moment. She's been in a temporary role, but heading on family leave, a real veteran of the number 10 machine for a bit. So possibly there's talk of splitting the job, a big SPAD figure maybe to do that side of it, and then someone to do the more organisational role on the model of a mixture of kind of Angie Hunter and Jonathan Powell in the Blair era. But it's complicated, to get two people who can work really well together, Sam, to do that Chief of Staff job. The present chaos kind of suggesting something needs to happen in that direction. But, I'm just hearing from people who would be in scope for either that or for Director of Communications. One joke going the rounds is he wouldn't even have time to write a memoir if indeed Keir Starmer were to be ousted sometime within the next year.
It does sound, from everybody I've talked to about number 10, that the atmosphere inside there is let's just get through to May. So it is a bit ironic that at the heart of the operation, they are underpowered, just at the point where the elections and the things that voters will judge them on could be existentially important for Keir Starmer after May. So underpowered at a critical point for Keir Starmer, but that is just a consequence of people not knowing the path of this government after May the 6th. So I think it is tricky.
Can I ask you a question?
Mm.
Would you split the chief of staff role? Because I think this is one of the things bubbling under, and in this really good long reads, there's just a sense that they're not absolutely sure what each job is supposed to do, right? So it's a very different model in the post-Morgan world, right? That we've both covered, and you've sort of covered it in detail what comes out of the pipe from that. Would you then say what Keir Starmer really needs, and you can sometimes feel, I think he's often quite sort of exhausted, and there's a lack of a sort of organisational support around the Prime Minister, which is so crucial. Different Prime Ministers do it in different ways. Or would you just go, and I think it's Darren Jones has cited it in the Politico piece, that you're really like super powerful spad who's across absolutely everything, because it's really more on policy and implementation that we're coming unstuck.
Well, the job has been split for the last few weeks, effectively, before Jill Cuthbertson went off on maternity leave. And the account that I got from elsewhere in Whitehall was one broadly of dissatisfaction. You could get agreement on things from Vidya Relaxon, the other sort of co-temporary chief of staff. But whether or not that meant that the thing happened and it went as expected, and that the visit ended up going ahead, or the policy announcement ended up being made in the media, that was unclear. The issue, Anne, isn't really the chief of staff, though. It's how they work with the principal. And the troubling question around Keir Starmer raised by figures in the Labour Party is always, you need leadership in number 10. Where does that leadership come from? And so it's less what's the exact formulation of the jobs, and much more the idea that government needs direction. So it's how whoever runs the organisation alongside Keir Starmer moulds with the principal and gets decisions out of him. Extraordinary pictures from an old advisor, Peter Hyman, this week, of trying to get Keir to spell out his priorities by putting them on bits of paper and arranging them in a diamond, and showing just how awkward he is about working out what he cares about most. What you need, whether it's one person or two, is a Keir reader. And it appears to me that they are in very short supply.
Wanted a Keir reader. Some cases going to draft the job description. There is just an interesting aspect of this I can see coming from Cabinet Office as Antonia Romeo settles into her job as the Cabinet Secretary and pushing, and I think we'll hear more from this in the next week from Nick Thomas-Symonds there about, well, we're going to cut red tape. Remember that one? Because no government's ever promised to do that one before, right? But no, they're going to have another go at cutting red tape and exorcising the ghosts of Whitehall, or some things that are apparently on this account holding up government business. You can imagine Romeo really pushing for that as one of her first moves in the job. But you do come back to, once if you've cut the red tape, you're left asking what the purpose of it is, and you come back to proposition A, which is, what does the person in charge really want to do more than he wants to do anything else? And that's the question that Peter Hyman was raising with that really interesting image there of the post-it notes and the diamond shape. Is you've got to know what is at the head, what's at the prow of that. Otherwise, you can cut everything out of the way, and you're still left with a pretty empty garden.
Another part of the big reorganisation from the new Cabinet Secretary, Antonia Romeo, is fewer write rounds. At the moment, government is done by a slightly archaic process of letter. She wants to dramatically reduce that and let departments make up their own decisions. Again, it works when you've got direction from the top and everybody knows what they're doing. We know what we're doing, and that is a podcast that has a 20-minute limit. Now, just a little house announcement. Incredibly, Westminster is about to take some time off. MPs will shout at me and say we're going to campaign for the local elections at the start of May, but it is Easter recess. Today's the last day that MPs are in the Commons. They're not actually back until the 14th of April. But you and I, Anne, we would never take such a indulgent period away from our microphones and our webcams. We will be back on Monday as normal, and we'll be back the week after with a special edition, just going through everything you need to know about the local, the Welsh and the Scottish elections to arm you, because that'll be the big topic once we get back the other side of recess. So, but a service from us, arguably more than some of our political friends. So join us on Monday and we will see you then.
Recess, but no rest for the wicked.